right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you are healthy and safe, and so are your loved ones. My name is Lisa May Simpson. I serve as the Vice President for Learning and Engagement at Forefront, and hopefully you're familiar with us. We are a statewide organization serving grant makers, operating nonprofits, and advisors, and our mission is to build a vibrant social impact sector for all the people of Illinois. We're glad that you're part of that sector. We're glad that you're joining us today. And we are also very glad to be partnering with Ted Bilich at Risk Alternatives to learn more about risk management for nonprofits. I can't think of a better time to be learning about it, given all the uncertainty that we are all facing. Before I turn it over to Ted, just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders. Your audio, your mics rather, are muted, but if you do have a question, we do want to hear you. So you can send any questions for Ted into the Q&A, and you'll find that down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Questions regarding technology or conversation with each other, I encourage you to type that into the chat, and I'm happy to answer any tech-related questions there. We are recording this, and we'll make that recording available on the Forefront website, and you'll get a link to that after we are wrapped up today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ted to introduce himself and get us started.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to Forefront for having Risk Alternatives do this presentation today. Thank you all for showing up. I know that you have so many things on your mind, and the notion of having one more thing to think about, even if it's something that can be robust and transformative for your organization, is hard to contemplate. So thank you very much. What I hope to be able to do is to keep you figuratively on the edge of your seat throughout the entire 90 minutes. But I'm going to talk about a little bit of ground rules right after I talk about myself to let you know why it is that I care so much about these issues. Just a little bit about my background. I came out of Harvard Law School back when we were still using clay tablets and styluses many, many years ago. And I went to work for a big international law firm called Jones Day in Washington, D.C. Traveled all around the world doing law for about 20 years. During that time, I also became a law professor at Georgetown University. No, I didn't have to wear a robe, but yes, it did involve a lot of interaction with people in big audience environments. I was interested in doing that because I love the process of learning. Every time I have the opportunity to talk about something, the cliche that you learn by teaching is absolutely true. And so by having an opportunity to interact with people, it gives me enormous energy and insight and joy. So that's why I do these sorts of things now. When I went to Georgetown, I had decided that I wanted to take my background in the law and marry it with my background in helping nonprofits. And the way that I decided to do that was to found this organization called Risk Alternatives back in 2011. If you remember, during that time, we were coming out then from the Great Recession. So a lot of nonprofits had been going through the ringer for a number of years. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? In fact, that ringer has expanded exponentially over the last 2 months. And we're in the midst of something that, as I was saying to Lisa before we started taping, is about as unprecedented as one could use that word to mean. So I started Risk Alternatives because I knew that nonprofits needed to develop resilience and sustainability. The tools of risk management, as we will talk about today, are simple, but they are extremely robust. And so they have the opportunity to give you a real leg up in dealing with uncertainty, especially the vast amount of uncertainty that you're currently dealing with. Here are the ground rules that I was talking about. The first ground rule is, as Lisa mentioned, if you have technical issues, you can put them in the chat, or if you want to talk to each other, you can put that in the chat. If you have questions, it would be that you'd like to pose to me. I would ask you to use the question function on Zoom, and you'll find that on your dashboard. And I do that because it's easier for me then to see those questions as distinct from any chatter that might be about technical issues. We will occasionally during the session try to use the raise hand function of Zoom. And let's try that now just by seeing whether people can find the raise hand button. If you can, raise your hand. Look at that. You guys, you know, a month and a half ago, I think more people would have had challenges with that. But we are now such old pros at Zoom that it becomes second nature to us. So thank you for that. One final ground rule that I think is very important, even if it sounds slightly artificial. I want you to be talking about issues that are of importance to you, but I don't want you to feel like you're putting your organization on the spot if you ask a question. So this final rule of thumb that we're using here is that when you pose a question to me, we are all going to assume that you're talking about some other organization, not your own, so that you are not placing your own organization under scrutiny by volunteering about something you've heard in your community, okay? If it turns out that you're asking for a friend and that friend happens to be yourself, we're not going to judge, but we're also not going to ask. So that can help you open up a little bit and ask your questions because it allows you the freedom to not have to be putting yourself out in the forefront as having a particular problem. Okay, with those as the ground rules, here's the roadmap for today. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the stakes for risk management. Not that any of you need a lot of rehearsal about that given COVID. I will then talk about some common vocabulary that I would urge you to use internally and externally when talking to funders and stakeholders like Forefront to talk about issues of risk management in ways that will lead to understanding rather than confusion. Finally, I will talk about practical takeaways, including, as we said in the invitation, some practical skills on inventorying your risk, returning to work, and scenario planning. Let's talk about the timing for this discussion. Nobody in their right mind can sit still in front of a screen these days for 90 minutes. I'm not expecting you to do that. In fact, my presentation is going to be designed around the theme of giving you a significant break. So the idea is we're going to take about 45 minutes and talk about the stakes and common vocabulary. After that, we are going to keep the link open, but you are all going to get up and check on the dog. You're going to check your email. You're going to get some water. You're going to do whatever other business you need to do for 10 minutes. And then you're going to come back and we will spend the 35 minutes that is the balance of my presentation talking about those practical takeaways. So 45 minutes, 10 minutes off, 35 minutes. And I'm just going to trust you that you're going to come back and you're going to leave the link open throughout that 10-minute break. Okay, now let's start with the stakes. One thing you could do if you wanted to look at why we talk about risk management is you could turn to Forefront itself and the Illinois Nonprofit Principles and Practices. You know, one of those principles, Principle 6E, says that a nonprofit should develop and adhere to a risk management plan. That's not surprising. In fact, that sort of language is mirrored by standards around the nation. But why might that be a best practice? I think there are a couple of reasons. Let's look at the nonprofit business model. In the first place, nonprofits have very thin operating margins. you don't have a lot of budgetary surplus. In fact, if someone has too much budgetary surplus in the nonprofit sector, unfortunately, funders and stakeholders will actually question whether that organization is doing the right thing. I personally think that's absurd. I think that nonprofits should be judged by their performance, not by their budgetary numbers. But nevertheless, it is very well known that nonprofits, by and large, live relatively hand to mouth. Secondly, and this is a distinguishing characteristic from a lot of other organizations, you use volunteers as board members. Again, it's perfectly understandable why you would do that. And board members serve an important role. But let's face it, a volunteer is never going to have as much available knowledge about the workings of the organization or as much interest in the organization as someone who is being paid to spend their time and effort focusing on those issues. So having a volunteer board creates challenges for the average nonprofit. The third thing is that you're often relying on volunteers to perform important functions. I know that's not true for everyone who's on this call, but many nonprofits need volunteers in order to do community outreach, in order to set up galas and fundraisers, sometimes in order to perform core services. Again, it's lovely that American citizens want to volunteer so much. We are a very good-hearted nation. But as everyone who's dealt with volunteers knows, it is really a full-time job to deal with volunteers because it's hard to train people when you can't coerce them, and it is hard to police them when you are not their boss. And so, unfortunately, the bounty of volunteerism is not an unalloyed benefit for nonprofits. Another distinguishing characteristic, of course, is that nonprofits often deal with very needy service populations. Over the last half century, America has made a determination that they were going to outsource most social services to the nonprofit sector. And so as a result of that, especially with social services nonprofits, they are often dealing with needy service populations. Moreover, some nonprofits are actually dealing with service populations who themselves pose risk to themselves and others. It is an unfortunate fact that people who are at risk are often posing risk to others. And therefore, sometimes, as a matter of prudence, nonprofits need to make sure that they are taking steps to ensure that there is safety and security for their employees and for their service populations, sometimes against self-harm or harm that they might do to others. Another element of the average business model for the nonprofit is one that most of you are familiar with. You tend to be understaffed. In the corporate world, they talk about needing to have redundancy. I think that in the nonprofit sector, we don't even have redundancy in the first place. We do not have enough people to perform all the functions in the average nonprofit. It tends to be team to the left, team to the right, fill the breach. Everyone's got to do everything. Finally, although this is not always the case, there is a perception that nonprofit staffs are lower paid than their for-profit competitor or peer organizations would be. As a result, it is hard to recruit, it's hard to retain, it's hard to ensure continuity for business over time. That's a tough business model. Even without COVID, even without a pandemic, it's a tough business model. It's a particularly tough business model when you throw in a world historic curveball like what we've seen over the last 2.5 months. So many organizations on the phone probably have strategic plans. I wonder how many of you actually have a risk management plan, a dedicated risk management plan. You know, because if you don't, your strategic plan is in some sense just a strategic hope. What I mean by that is that, yes, strategic plans, even in the absence of a risk management process, are important. You need to know what hill you're going to climb. But if you don't know your capacities, and if you don't know what you need to put in your backpack, well, there's no basis for you to saying you're ever going to make that trek and succeed. So strategic planning should actually come concurrent with or after risk management has been at least nibbled at, if not institutionalized. The ultimate stake, of course, is that you have stewardship obligations. You, as nonprofit leaders, are using other people's money to pursue some vision of the public good. As a result, you are stewards to your clients. You are stewards to your volunteers. And finally, you are stewards to your mission. In order to be able to commit to mission achievement, you need to know what your capabilities are. Finally, I think that Warren Buffett says it so powerfully here. You know, we work so very hard to make sure that people like us, trust us, and respect us. We work tirelessly for that. And all of it can fall through our fingers in a moment. This was true back when he first said it in the 1980s. It is true exponentially in our information era. When the push of a button, a Facebook post, a tweet, whatever the kids are using these days, can bring down an organization, whether or not there is accuracy and fact behind that tweet or post. So it is so important to at least be addressing the fact that there is uncertainty, so that we are mindful of the notion that oh, thank you, Patty. The camera is not on me, but on Lisa. And I'm not sure how that would change. Lisa, maybe, I don't care.
I'll address that in the chat. I think that's a per user sort of setting. So
okay,
I can respond to that in the chat if you want to keep going.
Thank you. And just to confirm with other people, here's a hand raiser. What I would expect you to be seeing is my presentation. If you're seeing generally my presentation, could you raise your hand? Excellent. Okay. Good. Good. All right. So I'm going to continue. I was talking about Warren, but now I want to move to the next segment, which is the vocabulary of risk management. Because if we're going to talk about something, we need to make sure that our terms are clear. Now, risk management really is a very simple thing. There are only a couple of core vocabulary terms. The core vocabulary terms are set out on this slide. The first one is important. It's important and to me obvious, but so often it's important and obscured to many people who are new to risk management. Risk is not a bad thing. Risk is not something that is something to be avoided. Risk simply means uncertainty. It means that our crystal balls don't work. I have one behind me, in fact. I bought it online, and I haven't been able to get the thing to work since I bought it. Fact is, I wasn't really expecting it to work, though, because we are imperfect beings and we can't see the future. If there's any question about whether risk is always a bad thing, though, think about when you were learning to ride a bike. You know, of course, there were issues, there were challenges, there were risks of a negative sort, but there was also this enormous possibility. This enormous world was opened up to you that you could jet around your neighborhood and still get home in time for dinner. So when you're talking about risk, don't talk about risk as synonymous with bad things. Risk simply means uncertainty. We distinguish in our practice then between negative risks and positive risks. Negative risks we call threats. Threats are bad things that could happen. It would be a threat to bike riding that you might fall. Opportunities, however, are positive risks. Opportunities are uncertainties, the potential for which is positive. So that enhanced freedom of movement, that feeling of being able to move faster than you could ever run, all of those were opportunities that were presented by your new initiative of learning to ride the bike. A risk management process, therefore, is simply a process of systematically looking for threats and opportunities, prioritizing them, responding to them, and then seeing how you did and doing more of it. In other words, risk management as a process is a simple thing. If you have a process in place for regularly identifying risks, prioritizing them, dealing with them, and doing that over and over again, you have a risk management process. One way to look at how risk management functions and what it really is to compare it to other things that it is not. So let's look at how risk management compares to some other things. First, risk management is not about worrying. Risk management is not about cowering and being afraid to look under rocks. No, risk management is about recognizing that there is uncertainty, trying to reduce uncertainty to the extent possible, but being clear-headed about the fact that there will be uncertainties that remain. That's not a worrying proposition. That is a proposition of comfort and peace of mind. Overwhelmingly, when people begin to do risk management, they don't feel overwhelmed. They feel empowered because for the first time, they start realizing how many balls they have in the air and, as equally as importantly, who's handling each ball. Risk management doesn't mean saying no to everything. No, risk management means saying yes with your eyes open. It means recognizing your actual capabilities, recognizing the actual things that could go wrong and could go right, and then taking the next reasonable response. The Stoic philosophers way back in Greece used to have a saying that life can present a series of obstacles, and you can always complain about the obstacle, or you can address the obstacle. You can look at the obstacle clearly and take the next reasonable step. And the Stoic motto was that in some way, the obstacle becomes the way. That by seeing what is in front of you, including the uncertainties, you feel empowered to take reasonable steps and chart a course forward. Risk management is also distinguishable from insurance. Insurance is a part of risk management, but insurance is way down the path of risk management. First, you need to identify what threats are out there. Then you need to deal with the ones that you can deal with on your own. Then with what's left over, or what you can't deal with fully on your own, then you consider insurance as an additional backdrop protection for you. All insurance is it's a way for you to shift certain residual risk that you can't deal with onto someone else by way of paying a price or premium. Risk management is also not strategic planning. Some of the language that you saw on my prior slide sounds a little bit like a component of strategic planning. You heard me talking about threats and opportunities and strengths and weaknesses. And that does sound like the SWOT analysis. But unlike strategic planning, which tends to be episodic and usually is revisited once a year, maybe once every 3 years, sometimes, unfortunately, once every 5, the idea behind risk management is to have a continual cycle of reviewing issues as they arise and prioritizing them and dealing with them. So one could reasonably think of risk management as the SWOT analysis made every day and operational. Finally, some people in the early stages of thinking about risk management question whether they need it because they have audited financials. I think most people on this call understand, though, that just because you have an auditor come in to confirm that your books are presented in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, that does not substitute for risk management. Auditors simply come in, take a sample, and ask some questions about your financial function. And then they either confirm that your financials are stated with reasonable comfort in conformity with generally accepted accounting principles, or they won't. Sometimes, along with that audit letter and opinion, they will give you a management letter that identifies some weaknesses that they see within the financial function. But importantly, they are not looking for everything. They are looking only within the financial function, and they are not warranting that if something isn't in the management letter, then you don't have a problem. So for instance, they're not going to identify that you have an operational issue. As long as your books are presented in conformity with GAAP, they're not going to say anything about that. They might anecdotally if they happen to see something, but they are under no obligation and they are unlikely to be looking for those sorts of issues. Okay, if that's what risk management is by contrast with other things, I just want to touch upon the 3 basic tools of risk management. Those tools are a way of identifying your risks, and that's called the risk inventory, a way of tracking your risks, and that's called the risk register, and finally, the cycle of doing this over and over again, including responding and assessing and improving, and that's called the risk cycle. So, first, the reason why you'd start with a risk inventory and the reason why it's the principal first tool is that you need to know where you are now. You need to know what your current strengths and weaknesses and threats and opportunities are. Until you have some awareness of those issues, you aren't sure what you might focus on. You might have anecdotally an annual operating plan. You might have a strategic plan that says you're going to take that hill over there. But until you look across your organization and assess what you are facing, well, you really don't know. You're stuck in the jungle. Once you do a risk inventory, and we'll touch upon this in the second half of my presentation about how to do a risk inventory, but once you do a risk inventory, you'd end up in the average organization with somewhere between 70 and 150 risks. Of course, if you got 70 to 150 things that you're trying to focus on, you're not focusing on anything. So you'd go through a prioritization exercise, and risk people would tell you you should capture that in a very simple document called a risk register. A risk register is a simple term for a simple tool. It's an Excel spreadsheet. It gathers all of those risks together. It says, this is what the risk is. It assigns who is responsible for monitoring that risk, what the next step is that the organization plans to take about that risk, and when someone is going to report out with respect to that risk. This is an incredibly powerful document because if you can get your organization to start using a risk register, you have a phenomenal tool for building a culture of learning within your organization. you have this phenomenal tool that you can pull out at your monthly staff meeting and say, okay, you know, Jane was responsible for talking about that for focusing on our top prioritized risk, which was staff attrition. Jane, what the register said you were going to be focusing on was you were going to do a survey of current staff to find out what key issues they are facing right now so that we have some data to work with. Where does that stand? And then Jane would be able to tell us where they stand on that. Jane might be able to say, and in light of that staff survey, although we had prioritized this as very high priority, I don't think the data really supports it being that high priority. I think we should move it down as far as priorities because other things are closer to the top of or should be closer to the top of the list. That is an incredibly cool discussion to be able to have. Jane has the ability to take ownership and responsibility for something. The executive director has the ability to be in dialogue with Jane about that issue. Others understand that their concerns are being heard and addressed, and everyone who sees the risk register has a reason for understanding why it is that you can't act on everything, including their pet issue, because different people have different perceptions. And ultimately, the executive director needs to work off of what she believes are the most important issues. Now, that's another footnote that I would point out with the risk register, is whenever you go through an inventory and you prioritize the risks, the prioritization would go to the executive director, and she would have the opportunity to change the priorities, because after all, no nonprofit should be run as a straight up democracy. It needs to be a benevolent dictatorship. But in doing that rejiggering of the priorities, even there, the executive director would be able to act with confidence that she had gotten the input of her staff and would be able to see things that she wouldn't otherwise be able to see. Finally, that risk management cycle. It's such a powerful tool because risk management is not an event. It is a journey. You don't do risk management once and never again. Instead, you do this over and over and over as a matter of routine. I hasten to add, however, that risk management does not become a thing unto itself that consumes a lot of time. On a net basis, once you start institutionalizing a risk management process, most organizations find that they are getting time back from the process, that they are putting in less time by adopting risk management than they were before, because the risk management process clarifies, it removes hindrances, it creates consensus, it creates direction. So net, the process of risk management will likely be a benefit in terms of time savings for your organization rather than a net time sink for your organization. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm a little bit ahead of schedule. I don't know whether that's because I had another cup of coffee right before I came on, or because I didn't say everything that I usually say about my slides. But what I am going to do instead is I'm going to ask a question because I see that there haven't been any questions posed to the questions and answers. There will also be a time at the end of the presentation when I'll be able to field more questions. But one question that I would ask is, by show of hands, and I don't want you to necessarily be talking about your own organization, but how many of those who are on this call believe that organizations like theirs, tend not to have a formal risk management process right now. Yeah, we're seeing a whole lot of hands, and thank you all. You can lower your hands now. We do a lot of research. One of the things that we do is funders pay us to come into a community and do a public workshop like this one, and we survey about current risk management processes. And when we do, we find that about 30 to 35% of nonprofits have a risk management process of the sort that I've described so far. As to the balance, it doesn't mean that they don't ever discuss risk. Some of them don't have a formal process, but they do raise risk issues periodically. Some of them raise risk issues only when something comes up. And believe it or not, there are some nonprofits who will admit during that survey process that they almost never raise risk issues unless they absolutely have to. So it is an issue where by starting down the path toward risk management, you would place yourself ahead of the curve of the average nonprofit. That can be of real benefit with funders. It can be a real benefit with potential stakeholders, because it is powerful to be able to go to a funder and say, look, we not only have a mission, we have a basis for saying that our mission is in good hands because we have a process for dealing with uncertainty in charting a course forward with that mission. A couple of years ago, back in 1917, I personally interviewed 125 foundation personnel from around the United States. In fact, more than 125, it was 125 foundations. I asked them a series of questions about risk management, and overwhelmingly, they expressed concern about whether their grantees had risk management processes. Overwhelmingly, they expressed support for the notion that risk management would be of benefit and that they would be receptive to helping nonprofits build risk management capacity. But overwhelmingly and sadly, they all were very strongly saying, look, we understand. Nonprofits tend to get pecked to death by ducks. They are living hand to mouth. They do not know whether they should raise the fact that they don't have risk management because they're afraid that they'll get dinged if they even ask the question. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Risk Alternatives is not only talk to the nonprofit sector, but we're also talking to funders. We're talking to funders about this same vocabulary. We're talking to funders about how if they care deeply about their communities, maybe they ought to host some sort of public workshop where they can begin a dialogue with their grantees and with nonprofit support groups so that people have a common vocabulary and can start bringing their worries and hopes out into the open. So it's a powerful thing to be a part of. We are really fortunate at Risk Alternatives to be dealing with this. COVID has simply made it that much more dramatic that risk management is necessary. I do see a question by Patrick. He asked whether we recommend assigning a risk officer or one individual in charge of risk. It's a good question. In the initial stages, Patrick, I would say you should be even more tentative than that. In the initial stages, you might want to have an exploratory task force to deal with risk that might be led by someone at the C-suite level, if you're that big of an organization, or maybe led by the executive director or the assistant director or chief of programs. And it should be a small group of 3 or 4 people. And that's who would do the initial risk inventory. The reason I suggest you do that is that I'm a strong believer in risk management, but I'm also a strong believer that every organization is a system, and systems react unexpectedly to new stimuli. So I always think that you should take things one step at a time and then assess, and then take another step and assess. Eventually, Patrick, you might find that risk management is creating some good aha moments, and that people are saying, oh yeah, this is worth our time and attention. In that circumstance, then the organization could reasonably make a decision. Do we want to, if we're big enough, do we want to hire someone as a risk officer? If we're not that big, do we want to formally assign that within the job description of one person? Those choices can depend upon the particular circumstances of an organization. Ultimately, I think that if someone moves forward with risk management, there needs to be someone whose job includes being the champion for risk management within that organization. And that person doesn't have to be the executive director or CEO, but whoever that person is needs to at least have the strong endorsement and support of the executive director or CEO.
Ted,
All right.
we got a question in the chat if you're open
yes.
to taking that now. Great.
Yes.
Marianne asked, what about an organization that has a written risk management process on paper but doesn't use it? Any suggestions about making it a living document?
Yes, I do have some suggestions for making it a living document, Marianne, and one of them I'll cover in the practical pointers in the second half of the presentation, and that is, if you have a risk management document on paper, one way to jumpstart it is to do a risk inventory, because all of a sudden those words become a little bit more real. If someone sees, oh, I see why we have a risk management process, it's so that we can identify the things that might be going wrong and the things that might be going right that we'd either like to, change on the one hand or change for the better on the other hand. All of a sudden you can empower people to start making it a living document. There are additional things, Marianne, that you can do, and you should feel free. This presentation will be shared with everyone at the end of the presentation, and it includes my email address, but you could always reach out to me as well, and I could give you some additional pointers. You're not alone the organization that you're talking about, your friend is not alone in asking that, because there are lots of organizations that do have risk management processes on paper, but they don't have a real risk management pulsing through their organization. A lot of people see it as a best practice. They place it as a checkbox exercise, and they think they're done. And as Marianne's question gets to the heart of, that's nowhere near true. In fact, if you have a risk management plan on paper and you're not doing it, you're setting yourself up for some real troublesome challenges if something goes wrong, because then someone says, well, even you said you were supposed to be doing this stuff. So it is, by my clock, 2:43 p.m. Eastern time, 1:44 p.m. Central. For the next 11 minutes, you are going to get the opportunity to talk to your spouse, check your email, check your dog, check your children. I'm going to go out and make sure that my boy and my wife are okay and pet my dog. I'm going to keep the link open. I ask all of you to continue to keep it open, and we will reconvene with the video for me on at 5 minutes till the hour. And I see, Suzanne, your question. I'll deal with that when we come back as a full group.
Welcome back, everybody. Ted, we can get started whenever you are ready.
Wonderful. Welcome back, everybody, as Lisa said. And I hope that you were able to stretch a little bit and to take care of a little bit of business so that you can focus on the last half of this presentation just as well as you did for the first half. Thank you so much of you for sticking around. I know that some people always have to drop off, and the fact that we get, 90% plus who are sticking around is fantastic. And one of the questions that came up during the break was whether we could send you a template for risk management. Suzanne, I'm going to make sure that you get some materials. In fact, that's one of the things that I'm going to go to right away. All right. In the second half, as I had mentioned, we're going to talk about some practice pointers, practical things that you can do starting today to take advantage of risk management as a possible process within your organization. And the first one is a risk inventory. As I mentioned before, a risk inventory is an exercise that is basically a structured brainstorming where you look for threats and opportunities throughout your organization. A couple of things about the risk inventory. First of all, when people first think about risk management, they tend to think of organizational risks as mostly external. They think about, client demands and funder demands and economic forces and natural disasters and pandemics and crooks and scam artists. In other words, they tend to be thinking that risk is about what can happen to them from the outside. Interestingly, most problems that an organization faces, most threats and most opportunities are internal to the organization. Back in 1977, during the height of an illustrious career as one of the best business consultants and professors ever, Peter Drucker concluded that up to 90% of even the best organizations' efforts tend to be of no value or actually harmful to that particular organization. Now, he doesn't mean that people are actively sabotaging. What he meant was that because of uncertainty about what the customer wants, and because of inherited ways of doing things that are not optimal in the current context, there is an enormous amount of waste, even in the most productive organization. Now, he said that back in 1977, and the world has definitely changed in the last 40 years or so. But I think that the fact remains that there still is an enormous amount of waste. In fact, I can be a little stronger than that. A lot of my research has focused on what people call lean management methodology. Lean management was something that was developed by Toyota back in the 1960s and 70s. They were competing against much bigger, much more well-funded car companies in the United States, and they needed to find ways to do more with less. So they tried to maximize the value of everything they did from the perspective of the ultimate consumer. If it wasn't of value to the ultimate consumer, then they scrutinized it and they either modified it to make it more value-oriented for the consumer, or they eliminated or somehow changed the process. This process improvement methodology moved from the factory floor to white-collar organizations around the world And there is a strong body of contemporary research about how much waste there is in average office environments. And as I say in that second bullet point, lean methodology practitioners would say that almost 95% of the activity in the average office is of no value to the ultimate customer. Now, some people see this slide, and first of all, they say that can't be true. And I'm willing to say, okay, maybe it's not 95%, but there's still significant waste. Others see this slide and they say, oh my gosh, how can we ever get anything done? This is a recipe for despair. To me, quite the contrary. This slide represents the pot of gold at most organizations. If your organization, in fact, has ways that it could be doing things better or not doing things that it shouldn't do, the fact is you are sitting on a pot of gold. It means that without needing more resources, without having to go to a funder on bended knee, you have the ability to unlock tremendous value for your stakeholders and beneficiaries. So I love the fact that most issues, most risks are internal to an organization. But how would you find them? Well, you'd perform a risk inventory. And the way you'd perform a risk inventory is you'd assign a small group, as I mentioned in the first half, maybe 3 or 4 people. Each of them would work independently. Each of them would identify 3 threats and 1 opportunity in each functional area of the nonprofit. In addition to looking at the internal functional areas, they'd also identify a few threats and opportunities that are external to the organization. Because while most risks are internal, it is important to pay attention to the external context. This sort of exercise, it takes about 40 minutes per person to thoughtfully identify 3 threats and 1 opportunity in each functional area. I see Diana's question, and I will respond to that in a moment. But the idea behind a risk inventory is to focus on the individuals who know the most about the organization and ask them to identify what they're worried about and what they're hopeful about. Because after all, someone external to the organization, while they may be able to provide additional input, having them assess your organization is almost certainly not going to be as clear-headed as drawing this out of the actual people who are actual boots on the ground, who actually do this work on a daily basis. So, Diana, in answer to your question where you ask whether the inventory should be completed by a third party when possible, it depends what you mean by completed. We like to help organizations to go through risk inventories because we can not only streamline the risk inventory process, but then we can add input and we can identify additional issues that might need to be looked at. In that way, yes, outside input can be valuable, but I would not suggest that you have someone come in and simply evaluate or perform a risk assessment for your organization. That is not the way I would start. I would start with an internal risk inventory. Chuck, it's like you're reading my mind here. Chuck asks me to please define and describe the functional areas. Well, I'll do one better. I'll give you a picture. You can break up a nonprofit in lots of different ways. We break it up this way. We think about the functional areas of a nonprofit as including operations, which is to say what you actually do to help your end users. There's IT, there's finances, there's talent management, recruiting, hiring, training, promoting, disciplining, terminating if necessary. There's reputation management, both public relations and marketing. There's development. There's sales. Most nonprofits are involved in some sort of sales function that is not just sales to donors, but some form of sales to the end users, even if there is no real price involved. There are also functional areas like risk management and compliance and planning and visioning and governance. And Chuck, like I said, you can slice it up a lot of different ways, but we like this way of slicing it up because, honest to goodness, we think every nonprofit has these functions. Now, don't hear me as saying every nonprofit has a sales head and a risk management head. It's that these are functional areas within a nonprofit, some of which may be handled by people who have multiple hats on, and some of which are not officially really acknowledged by the organization at all. But when we do a risk inventory, we ask each participant to look at each one of these functions and identify threats and opportunities as to each one. And then, as you see, in addition to those functional areas, Chuck, you would look at the external context, political, social, economic issues that could impact the organization from outside. Now, I know that's a lot to digest, but I'm going to give you one better than digestion here. There's a guide. It is available for free on our website. This is the link to it. And when we circulate the PowerPoint from this presentation, you'll be able to copy that and you can get the guide for free. What it'll do is it'll tell you how to do it, and it will tell you what sorts of things you might expect if you do it. Because, like I said, every nonprofit is a system. The system might react positively. It might react negatively. It will definitely react in some ways by going through a risk inventory. Of course, I wouldn't advise that you take that step if I didn't have confidence that almost every nonprofit who goes through the risk inventory is going to derive enormous benefit from it. I have never, ever in my years of experience had a nonprofit say, oh my gosh, we never should have opened that can of worms. In fact, I have never had any nonprofit look at their risk inventory and say that they have created worry by going through the process. They always end up saying, my goodness, we finally have some peace of mind. We see places where there's low-hanging fruit to pick and get immediate value, and we gain clarity from this process. So you can go and you can get the free download. And when, I forget who it was who asked the question about, is there a risk management template? This is where I would start. There are other pieces of data on our website. If you go to the free downloads tab on our website, you can see things like, I think there's a timetable for how you'd be able to implement risk management over time. There are documents relating to what sorts of standards are out there about risk management. Lots of things are on our website for free. So this is but this is where I would suggest you start. Patrick, I think your question is a good one. He asked the question of whether there's a risk, a threat, I would say, that the inventory becomes an inventory of everything, or that it becomes, you know, a list upon which a list that people use to complain. You know, it is a possibility, and that's one of the issues that we would have. There are things that you can do to address that potential threat. In fact, in the complimentary guide, we recommend a couple of books that are very good about dealing with crucial conversations. But again, while that is a possibility, if you set the ground rules well as far as telling people why you're doing this and what it is an opportunity for, rarely do you find that people will use it as an opportunity to point fingers or grouse. So yes, there is a possible risk of that happening, but overwhelmingly, we've found that it is a constructive and not destructive process. The second practical pointer that I'd like to talk about is I promised that you would get some good old-fashioned guidance about what you should do as you think about transitioning back to work. I have three main points with respect to back to work. The first one, I need to say this out loud to give you the comfort that you're on the right track if you're taking things cautiously. We do not know the nature and scope of this pandemic yet. We should be careful about how rapidly we go back to a sense of assumed normalcy. You do not want to place yourself in the position as leaders of your nonprofit as having your organization be a potential vector for disease. You don't want to have that among your beneficiary population. You don't want to have that among your employee population. So take a cautious approach to the re-engagement exercise. A second bit of practical advice that I would give you is, as you think about returning to normal, take some time, maybe even a mini retreat of an hour and a half or so, broken up with a 10-minute stretch session with your staff, where you talk about what worked well during the quarantine and what you found was truly essential in terms of your service offerings. Let me break that down a little bit more. What worked well during the quarantine? I think that a lot of organizations, both in the for-profit and nonprofit sector, are going to come back to work with an appreciation of online tools that they didn't have before. They're going to realize that some things can be done by Zoom and don't have to be done in person. They may come back with a different sense of the value or the trade-offs involved in remote working. That doesn't necessarily mean that people will remain 100% remote work or that this is a free pass never to have to come into the office again. However, it is worth reflection upon the benefits and drawbacks that people found during the work from home process so that those issues are captured for further discussion down the road when hopefully COVID is nothing but a memory that we've gotten well beyond. That other sub-bullet point about what was essential, it sometimes takes a crisis to act as a crucible to boil an organization down to its most essential functions. You may have found that you gave up certain activities on behalf of your donors, certain activities on behalf of your beneficiaries, certain activities on behalf of your employees, and that was a good thing. Take time to reflect who you're serving, what they actually want and need, and whether you need to go back to business as usual in the way that you provide those materials to them going forward. So take time to reflect on what this crucible has told you about the essential functions of your organization. My final back to work pointer is one where I always say you should never reinvent the wheel. And there's an insurance company called Hub that is actually, I think its world headquarters is in Chicago. They do great work. And Hub put together a back to business playbook It's a fairly lengthy document. It's 35 or 45 pages long, but boy, is it good. And I would suggest that you follow the link that I put up here and download that playbook. Again, it's free. And I know some of the people who had input in it, and rather than risk alternatives doing something like this, I felt that it was better that we should simply give credit where credit is due, and boy, is credit due to Hub International for what they did in putting together that playbook. Final point that I want to make before I take questions is I promised that I would give you some practical pointers on scenario planning. Let me start out with dispelling a myth about scenario planning. People sometimes say, well, we need to scenario plan because we need to decide what's going to happen and what we're going to do about it. That's not scenario planning, that's forecasting. Forecasting is making a prediction about what is going to happen. Forecasting is always imprecise because, as we've said, forecasting can never deal with the essential uncertainty that humans face as being imperfect creatures. Scenario planning is a different thing. Scenario planning is a consideration of the present in light of possibilities that might happen. So let me give you a practical example. A scenario that you might be able to think about with your team would be the one that I've listed on this slide. Imagine that it is November of 2020, so 6 months hence, and you are facing a double whammy. It's a double whammy that I think a lot of nonprofits may face, but you're facing this. Let's hypothesize. On the one hand, your your demand for your services, your beneficiary population is demanding more of what you do. They are in need and they need more of what you do. So you're facing 110% of the demand that you faced in November of the previous year. At the same time, you're in the middle of a recession, and boy, it may be a deep one. And so you are facing having only 80% of the budget that you thought you would have, 80% of the budget that you had in November of 2019. Okay, that's the scenario. You would ask your staff 3 questions about that scenario. And the first one is going to make you chuckle maybe because it sounds like I'm being contradictory with my first bullet point. The first one is you ask your staff, how likely is that scenario? But you see, you're asking not because you want a prediction, but instead you want to unearth people's presumptions, people's assumptions, and what issues you might need to research in order to gain more insight into the uncertainties that you might face. So you ask that question not so much because you want to know whether this is 75% likely to happen or 45% likely to happen, but why does someone say it's 75 whereas someone else says it's 45? So you ask first, how likely is the scenario and why do you say that? The second question is a powerful one. It is, what would you want to be doing in November 2020 if that scenario came true? Why would you ask yourself that question? Well, you have a chance now to avoid having to answer issues in a crisis. By reflecting forward like that, you have a chance to give your future self some guidance by saying, well, in the event that we faced this sort of scenario, this is what we would hope and expect to be doing then in terms of response. We would expect to have cut this program by such and such. We would have expected to not start this new initiative so that we would be able to have some additional, some contingency in the budget. We would hope to not have hired someone and filled an expected full-time equivalent position that we expect to have come open over the next couple of months. Those are the sorts of things that we would want to be doing then. We would want to be in a position to have done then if the scenario came true. And then you ask the third question of your staff. Well, okay, based on our discussion about how likely the scenario is and why people think that and what we'd want to be doing then if the scenario came true, what would we want to be doing now on June 10th, 2020, in order to prepare for the possibility, the weighted possibility of the scenario actually coming true? Powerful questions that you can ask in an exercise with your staff that can unearth threats and opportunities and can allow you to act now while you have the possibility of doing something small now that ramifies, that has ramifications that are much more powerful a few months from now. So that's a roadmap for a practical scenario planning exercise that you could do with your staff. And I know I went through that quickly. So I want to give you another way that you can find out about scenario planning. If you go to our website, riskalts.com, and you simply search for the term scenario planning, you'll see a recent blog post that I wrote that asks, should you be doing strategic planning right now? No, here are 3 things you should do instead. And one of them is scenario planning. And I talk about what I just said in some detail. So while it's not the exact script that I was working off in my impromptu remarks today, it captures on a point-by-point basis how you could go through a scenario planning exercise with your staff and get real benefits from that exercise. Now, I promised that I would leave some time for questions in case anyone had some. This is how you would get in touch with us if you wanted to get in touch with us down the road. There's my email address. There's our website. There's our phone number. I do urge you to reach out to me because I really enjoy talking about this stuff. And I know that in a Zoom webinar format, it's sometimes hard to both listen and formulate your questions. So if you have questions afterwards, I urge you, shoot them to me. I always respond because, as you can tell, I'm pretty enthusiastic about these issues. Lisa, I don't know if whether on reflection you had any questions that you might want to ask, but if you have any, go ahead, and that will give people an opportunity, if they have any questions, to add additional questions to the Q&A section.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. And first of all, just thank you for such a thoughtful and thorough presentation. I saw some feedback in the chat that folks are really finding it useful, and I know I did as well. I've got a few to-dos on my list.
Good.
So just to bring us back to, you said the first step should always be, taking an inventory, which makes sense. I'm curious, what do you see that tends to show up? Like, do you see trends, like things that surprise people when they take that first step and take that inventory?
Here's one, Lisa, that comes up always, and I mean always, on a risk inventory. The presentation of it can come up in various ways. Sometimes people say, we're worried because whenever someone comes into the organization, it takes a lot of time to bring that person up to speed because we've got to convey a lot of information to them. Another way that it comes up is people say, gosh, we're worried that if, the hit with a bus issue, We're worried that if we lose one of our key personnel, we're going to lose a vast amount of data and expertise and savoir-faire. Other people will say, we're not sure what the process is for doing a certain thing. In fact, there's a friend of mine who has a great statement about processes that I'll get to. But even though the presentation issue may sometimes differ from organization to organization, the underlying threat that bubbles up on everyone's nonprofit risk inventory is that they have not spent enough time determining what their core processes are and then documenting those core processes. As a result, they worry that if the executive director leaves, we won't know the thank you process because she always does that on her own. They worry that if the development coordinator leaves, well, then we're going to have to redo the whole Rolodex because we don't know exactly who all our potential donors are. They're worried that it takes so much time to train a new person on the front lines because, well, really, there are lots of different ways that you could look at our processes. My friend Karen says that there are 4 ways to look at a process. The first way is the way that the executive director or CEO thinks the process happens with the boots on the ground on the front lines. The second way of looking at a process is what is currently documented about that process, how we actually say we do it right now. The third way you could look at that process, though, is if you actually go and watch it being done, you'll see that people are doing things differently from the first 2. Different from the way that the leaders think it's being done, and different from the way that it's written down. And then the fourth way to look at a process is how powerfully that process could be done if you clearly articulated the first 3 and harmonized them. And so the power of identifying not every process, but what are your most important processes, and then taking the time slowly, over time, to document, not in a 30-page document, but in a 2-page bullet point, what it is that process does and how it's done. That is the most surprising risk that turns out as an aha, because even though it is presented in various different ways, everyone who does a risk inventory ends up saying that in one way or another.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense and it resonates. We have started using the term, what if you win the lottery, instead of, we felt terrible about imagining a day when one of our colleagues might get hit by a bus. So we prefer now to imagine a positive outcome.
My wife, who works for a nonprofit, this morning when I talked about the bus test, she said, no, Ted, it's the lottery test now. So, okay, all right.
But that actually brings me to another question, which is so when it comes to driving this risk management and risk assessment, do you suggest that lives with the staff primarily, or is that a board governance issue?
Ultimately, it is a governance issue. And so the board plays an important role with respect to governance. The board plays an important role with respect to risk management, but that role is quite limited. All a board is supposed to do is to make sure that staff is doing risk management. It's supposed to weigh in on the most important risks, and it's supposed to set the tone at the top that risk management and compliance and governance are important guiding concepts for the organization. That's the board's role with respect to risk management. The staff's role with respect to risk management is to nibble on the outer edges and begin to engage in it, to do a risk cycle and embed that within the organization, and then to feed that up into the board so that the board can ensure that the staff is doing its work and weigh in on the most important risks. So when I think about risk management, the initiator tends to be usually someone in the C-suite, either the executive director slash CEO or someone else at a senior position with the endorsement and support of the executive director or CEO. And so that's where I would expect risk management leadership to begin, is at the staff level, somewhere in the C-suite, but not necessarily always with the executive director, but always with the endorsement and not just acquiescence of the executive director or CEO.
Fantastic. That's really helpful clarity. Thank you. So I think we're just about at the end of our time together. I haven't seen any additional questions in the Q&A or the chat, but some appreciation from Sarah and from Patty for a very thought-provoking and practical presentation. So I will affirm that from my perspective as well. Thank you, Ted. Thank you to all of you who joined us. And please, as I do want to just affirm Ted's recommendation to reach out to him for further questions. Thank you all for being with us. Be well, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for attending.